Welcome all to Juris North, our discussion today, November. Before we start, welcome our presenter today, Dr. Zubair Khan from India, and I'll do the introduction in a second. I'll welcome the attendees. For those who are not coming today, we are recording only the very first part of this discussion. It will be again Dr. Zubair Khan from India. The rest of the questions and answers, the actual discussion will take place outside the recording time, just to protect different people and their legal rights. We have many people from different countries, different jurisdictions. So it's just we have the permission from Dr. Khan to do his part, to share his part. Juris North, we are 7 different institutions. I'm simply the face today. We used to do these sessions face-to-face in England at any of our universities. Right now, because the situation, all the chairs, we decided to do everything online, just for the well-being of our presenters and our attendees. Last thing I want to say, we will have today one specialist, and that's the format we follow, different from our other roundtables or online events. In our case, we are simply people willing to learn from each other. So we are entitled to ask any questions. We don't have professors or students, academics or non-academics. We have one specialist today from India, and the rest of us, we will be asking any question we have. Without anything else to say about Juris North, thank you very much, Dr. Zubair Khan. Dr. Khan is from the University School of Law and Legal Studies, from Guru Gobind Singh Indraprastha University in New Delhi, India. And Zubair will talk today about challenges to poverty alleviation in COVID-19 scenario, a plight of domestic migrant workers in India. Something quite relevant, because right now all the world, not only India, is dealing with 2 things, a pandemic and poverty. So thank you very much, Dr. Zubair Khan, and you have the floor now. If you want to start.
Yes, thank you so much, George. Now I can, hello everyone. Now I can screen the share.
Yes, it's working.
Is it visible?
Yeah, perfectly visible, yes.
Okay, so hello everyone. My topic is challenges to the poverty alleviation in COVID-19 scenario, the plight of domestic migrant workers in India also. Uh, this pandemic is, of course, a very social, economic, and as well as humanitarian crisis altogether. And we all know, we all know, and we all have read from the last few months also. But the topic which I have chosen altogether is somehow very much related with the poverty concept also. So when I go with this particular idea about poverty, we came to know that the poverty is something which is an ongoing endeavor altogether. And this is something which there are many theorists, there are many economists who have attempted their best to define the word poverty altogether. But in whatever manner they were able to define this word poverty, we came to know there's only one particular concept which is quite common in almost all the definitions, almost all the theories, that is the economic deprivation also. And this economic deprivation is somehow related with the lack of social security, the social inferiority is inherent, which is in it altogether. And I must say that in all those senses altogether, one thing which is very much common, that is the lack of basic material needs also. Initially, in the early periods of 60s and 50s, when we have been asked to define and characterize this poverty, we have constituted into 2 parts basically. One is the absolute poverty, second one is the relative poverty altogether. Though there are many statistical data across the developing countries, across these many South Asian countries also, where they are able to define the absolute poverty altogether based upon the per capita income, based upon the monthly consumption rates altogether. But with regard to relative poverty is something, it is very difficult because there are many terms and conditions, there are many formulas which has been applied by many statistical authorities altogether. So, but over the period of time, we have realized one thing, that should we restrict ourselves in defining this concept in 2 parts, that is the absolute poverty and the relative poverty also, or is it something much beyond than the absolute and relative poverty altogether? Now, when we see the context of Indian legislations and the Indian policies which has been established over the period of time for the last 50 decades, we found that the concept of poverty, or the benchmark which has been created by this poverty concept, cannot be limited up to relative and the absolute poverty altogether. It is something much beyond than the issues altogether. And in that direction, which is very much important, that somehow maybe in the near future we have to see who can be called as a poor person also, and who can be called as the poorest of the poor people altogether also. Many social welfare schemes which has been introduced and to implement altogether, and there we find number of challenges even in the implementation also. So whenever we face the challenges, whenever we find those challenges in the implementation, these are the basic areas which are found altogether. That is the lack of entitlement also, material and the non-material resources also, lack of opportunity also, and as a result of which social exclusion is somehow very much important. Now, we have considered over the period of time, do we consider poverty as a violation of human rights? And if the answer is yes, that it is considered as a violation of human rights, then of course, over the period of time, it must mobilize the public action altogether. So in that direction, this nature of poverty has to be understood in a very particular point of view also. And as I said earlier also, the theorists have attempted their best to estimate the poverty altogether. There have been number of attempts made by number of governments, number of bodies over the period of time also. Some have decided on the basis of calorie also. Some have decided based upon the prerequisite altogether, the basic needs. Somehow there have been certain issues where income is the main issue, which has been to play a very important role also. In our country, in the after independence, we found out there are a number of industrial policies and labor policies has been created also. And as a result of which, we found out that there's a social and economic discrimination based upon income also. So as a result of which, we have realized that we need to bring uniformity in the income classification altogether. And but somehow over the period of time, our country have faced number of issues, war with neighboring countries also. We have faced number of natural disasters also, famine in many parts of the country. And as a result of which, we find there are many income shocks altogether. So those income shocks, either it has been estimated, either it has been calculated by the government of India at a central level, but at the state level, at the regional level, it has not been calculated altogether, because of the major reasons, because of the major problem that is about the population altogether. Right now, we have 1.33 billion. In the last year, when it was calculated in the year 2018, we are 1.33 billion population altogether. Now, so it is very difficult to actually implement the basic principles of you can say the common good principles which we have enshrined through our constitution also. In the Constitution of India, tomorrow we are going to celebrate the Law Day, that is the creation of our Constitution altogether. So we have decided to that we're going to read about the preamble recitation altogether, which discuss about liberty, opportunity, equality, and as well as the common good principle also. But somehow it is very much important altogether how the income shock seems to be very crucial in nature also. There will be many more areas where the estimation of poverty has been rather into consider also. For example, in the case of poverty of opportunities also seems to be very important there also. In present scenario, in the recent pandemic phase altogether, poverty of opportunities somehow needs to be understood altogether. There are many attempts has been made by many NGOs, national based NGOs and international based NGOs, to define this poverty of opportunity altogether, that how this poverty of opportunity has been described. So I'm going to discuss what actually is poverty of opportunity is important. But over the period of time, that is also very much important, that is about multidimensional poverty index also. Now this multidimensional poverty index is somehow important altogether because it actually classifies 4 important parts altogether. One, it talks about the resources, which seems to be there also. Second, it talks about the human security, which is important there also. And the third, it talks about the choice factor also. So these 3 for opportunity, choice factor, resources, they are the main play very important role altogether, where the government of India had attempted their best to define the multidimensional poverty index also. But we see this definition of multidimensional poverty, which has been defined there also, it plays a very important role for the government of India, especially in the year 1990 also, to introduce the concept of public distribution system also, PDS. Now, this PDS system seems to be very important during those days also, because that time they have realized that it actually play a very important role, possibly not maybe that in the terms of reducing the poverty, or maybe in terms of poverty eradication, but it may actually plays a very important role to especially to tackle the problem of food insecurity also. So we have seen that India have we have received a very low rank altogether in the case of the global hunger index and the global poverty index altogether. So in those scenario, this multidimensional poverty index seems to be very crucial in nature there also. But at the same time, we also find out there have been many theoretical perspective of poverty which has been considered altogether. For example, liberal and constitutional framework are there also. Now, this liberal and constitutional framework is somehow very important there also. It has its own weakness, it has its own objective, which seems to be very crucial in nature. For example, whenever it talks about the constitutional perspective, it actually talks about the basic element of SDG1 also. If you remember the SDG1 goal, which discuss about to end the poverty by all means altogether. But when we discuss about the MDG altogether, it only the first goal of MDG also, it only concentrate upon the poverty reduction altogether. It does not relate with defining the poverty. It does not relate with what are the types of poverty which are important altogether. So in that context, the liberal or the constitutional framework is somehow important altogether. That the first state, while implementing, while having the successful implementation of SDG goals and MDG goals, it is important to see the constitutional framework altogether. That what kind of the social security mechanisms, what kind of the equitable development which has been taken into consideration altogether. Because you see, in our country, we find number of issues. For example, we discuss about intergenerational poverty issues also. Now, this intergenerational poverty is somehow, it's nothing but a type of a poverty trap altogether, where nobody can able to escape from those poverty line altogether. Though we have calculated, many theorists have, and even the government authorities have calculated who are the persons who may come below the poverty line, who are the persons which may come above the poverty line, that we call this a BPL and an APL altogether. But does it really follow the rigorous approach altogether? Whether those formulas actually give the most accurate information altogether? And a researcher like us altogether always question those things altogether. And that is why the constitutional framework seems to be very important in nature also. That it's very important to define and understand the weakness which is there altogether. That whatever radical approach we may adopt altogether, maybe in the one decade or maybe in another decade, it may not be important in over the period of time. Especially when our country there is a paradigm shift in economy after liberalization, privatization, globalization also. It was the major period altogether, that is about 1990 altogether. Now, there have been many people who are quite excited, many economists who are quite excited about LPG altogether, that they're going to bring a paradigm shift in the economy also. But at the same time, there are many other ruling classes, other people who are working, they have started protesting against the LPG altogether. So in that direction, the constitutional framework how seems to be very important altogether also, to understand what is equitable development altogether, how we can and actually understand the equitable development also. The second perspective is technocratic framework also. Now, this technocratic framework is somehow very crucial altogether, because in this case, we have to see that how the government of India and how the government of different developing states actually involved altogether. Now, over the period of time, we found out the governments have realized that this may be the static formula which we have applied, and these may be the reasons for the poverty altogether. So they have identified number of causes for the poverty altogether, and there they says to eradicate the poverty, it is important to pinpoint towards the causes of the poverty also. And as a result of which, many social protection floor which has been introduced altogether. There are many theorists altogether, anti-poverty theorists, which have defined at many international and national level, where they discuss about social protection floor also. Now, what is this social protection floor actually? The social protection floor is basically talking about that we need to introduce those kind of public welfare policies which can actually help them to empower altogether. But the point is whether right to have self-determination, whether say empowerment is really easy task altogether, especially where we found the people are illiterate altogether, and especially where people are not able to survive altogether. There is a complete lack of livelihood altogether and employment opportunities altogether, and especially where we find number of challenges in the case of rural and urban migration altogether. I'm going to come up the very important issue that is about rural and urban migration altogether. And we come with a belief altogether, this technocratic framework, and many theories have believed this thing altogether, that migration is actually a successful tool for poverty reduction also. But the real question might come whether it is really true or not. That is, seems to be subject matter of contemplation also. The third principle is that is the Gandhian principle altogether. Now, this Gandhian principle is somehow it's a altogether different principle altogether, because you see it depends upon the rule of law perspective altogether. A very idealistic approach which has been adopted there also. Now, in this thing, many NGOs, many stakeholders have came forward altogether, and they have able to define the particular issues also. I have read some number of reports where we have found out that in those cases, they have clearly mentioned that there are many extreme poor people who have been left out of the public distribution system altogether also. We do not know actually altogether how many family members who are living in a household also. So again, it is a very challenging task altogether. The kind of people who are living in the urban area, and the kind of poor people living in the urban area, they have a different social stratification altogether. So when we see number of diversification, it is very much important to adopt an idealistic approach also. Of course, it has its own challenges also. It is not a very easy task to adopt this Gandhian principle altogether. So these are the theoretical perspective which seems to be very crucial in nature altogether. Now, the main concept is that is the COVID-19 and the way ahead altogether. Now, the issue which has come altogether from this pandemic phase, it was very clear altogether that it resulted into huge loss for the state and for the people altogether, for the medium class society people also, and for the lower class society altogether. Now, we have found altogether when the lockdown, which has been extended over the period of time altogether, it actually increased the problem of poverty altogether. In the pre-COVID area altogether, in the pre-COVID era, we found that the government of India have attempted their best to adopt number of social mechanisms also, so as to make it as a self-reliant India altogether. But at the same time, in this pandemic phase also, we have seen that there are a number of challenges we are facing altogether. What kind of challenges which we are facing? We find out that the lack of employment opportunities altogether. The consumption rate has been reduced up to a very low level altogether. So this economic crisis is actually creating a major obstacle for the government of India for in the case of poverty eradication altogether. And as a result of which, we found out that all those things which we discuss about number of literature related with urbanization, it has been reduced there altogether. Now, urbanization is a very important factor altogether. We found out that in the urbanization altogether, that there are many people who are moving from the rural area to the urban area altogether. Usually, in many texts altogether, we consider that migration is somehow considered to be kind of three categories also. One is the voluntary migration, second one is the forced migration, and the third one is seasonal migration also. Voluntary migration is somehow where a rural people might go to some other state altogether, to a city altogether, where to look for more employment opportunities also. So he may be able to afford something. That is why he might go to a central level to look for more employment opportunities also. But forced migration is a matter of concern also. though there has not been any particular study which is made right now altogether to understand what is the impact and what are the reasons for forced migration also. But we found out that in most of the cases, forced migration is nothing but a subject matter of social exclusion also. We found out in many rural areas that many persons who are we are many farmers who are called as a landless farmers also. There are someone who are called as seasonal farmers also. In many households there are number of persons who may be living altogether. So as a result of which we found out that there are many migrants who actually want to transfer, looking for the employment opportunities, and they look forward towards the urban areas also. So in that case, urbanization seems to be very important in nature also. And we found out that many theorists who have argued this point, that this migration is actually play a very important role for the poverty reduction tool altogether. However, there is another very important opinion, which is that is related with urban poverty altogether. Now, this urban poverty is somehow very important altogether, because we have found out in many urban cities also there are many illegal slums which has been created altogether also. Many people, many construction workers, or many can say many contract workers who have not been registered with the so-called their welfare board altogether, and as a result of which they do not find efficient infrastructure in the urban areas also. So due to the lack of rural infrastructures, due to the lack of employment opportunities, they move with this expectation in the urban areas that they can get opportunities also. But in the urban areas altogether, we found out the monetary poverty level has been reduced at a very low level also. The cost living, or the cost factor, the living cost altogether, which is there in the urban areas, is very high altogether, for which a rural person may not able to afford it altogether. And that is why these are the many risks which are inherent with this urban poverty altogether. Risk number one, which is important in this pandemic phase, that is the health risk also. We found out in this lockdown period also that now in those cases that they are, due to the lack of literacy, due to the lack of other basic opportunity, basic needs also, the health issue seems to be a very major concern for the poor people altogether. So this lack of primary healthcare, secondary healthcare has actually affected the people who are living in the slum areas altogether, especially in the urban areas. I'm not talking about rural area. In rural area, the situation may be altogether horrible. We cannot imagine altogether. But in the urban area, the situation is there also. The second risk factor, which is about monetary risk altogether. So monetary risk is, and again, with is a lack of employment opportunities, which have discussed altogether. The third factor is the shocks, which is important altogether. The economic shocks, which is there also. So this economic shocks is basically those kind of shocks where we found out that there are many temporary settlements which has been offered to these many workers, many seasonal workers also. Now, we have found out in our country also, and many developing countries, there is a high risk of eviction of those temporary settlements also. Now, again, this is another very important issue, that those kind of economic shocks, which specifically include these kind of temporary eviction or this permanent eviction, has caused a major problem for the migrant workers who are living in an urban area altogether. The third factor, which is important, that is about inadequate government risk altogether. The inadequacy services which has came into picture altogether. Unfortunately, in our country also, the government do not have an idea particularly as to how many migrant workers has been shifted from urban areas to rural area also during this lockdown altogether. There is no exact data, statistical data, which shows that how many persons who have traveled from one state to another state, probably by 1,000 kilometers, which they have traveled on their own feet. They do not have an idea altogether as to how many persons who have died altogether in this pandemic phase also. So this seems to be a very important factor, that inadequate services which has been offered by many state governments within the country itself also. So this is another very important factor, that how urban poverty seems to be a major problem for the first issue also, where we usually consider as that migration can be considered as a poverty reduction tool. So in that context, another very important factor which needs to be understood, what is a reverse migration altogether? Or in other words, what is actually a distress migration altogether? There have been many theories which attempted their best to define this reverse migration also. though their studies has not given complete picture altogether. But reverse migration is basically talking about the lack of urban governance altogether, the lack of opportunities which we are facing altogether also. Maybe due to the political interference, maybe due to the administrative interference also. Even we can see the poverty trap, the so-called poverty trap, which may not exist only in rural areas, but also in urban areas also. So this poverty trap has to be understood altogether. It is not something which can be understood that only in the rural area also. That those poor people or those extreme poor people may not come from the rural area to a semi-urban areas also. But it is also possible even in the urban areas also. So that compel us to understand this reverse mechanism altogether. And that is why I'm trying to correlate that this reverse mechanism actually classified the third category of poverty, that is called as situational poverty altogether. Right now, we have still discussed, or number of theories have discussed about absolute poverty and relative poverty also. But situational poverty is something where we do not find sufficient literature as such where we can discuss altogether. But yes, certain attempts has been made by few theorists where they are able to define that situational poverty is something in an unanticipated situation altogether, something which is maybe based upon natural disaster altogether, something which may be based upon cyclone and earthquake, etc., etc. also. But again, its definition is somehow seems to be very important altogether. Now the time is important that even the World Bank should take initiative to do a comparative study based upon this situational poverty altogether. Because you see, this pandemic is also an unanticipated event altogether. So that is why I can say that this reverse migration actually leads to situational poverty altogether. Now the issue is when all those migrant workers who have uh, who have shifted to their rural areas also. Interestingly, we saw there's an increase of, you can say, consumption in their household also, in many households in the rural areas also. And we saw even there's a substantial growth in the agriculture field, in agriculture growth altogether. So for in that sense also, many agriculture governments, many agriculture societies also have saw a change altogether. But at the same time, you see, it may not work in for the long period of time also. The government of India have introduced many schemes where they can offer number of employments in the rural area also in the last few months also. But that scheme which was applicable only for 125 days also. So again, the kind of infrastructure, the kind of expenditure, public infrastructure, expenditure, which is required for the agriculture economy is relatively very less also together. So in that context, we have to understand what are the major consequences, what are the major implications of this situational poverty altogether. That is why the approaches to the urban poverty is somehow very much important. So these are the three ways, these are the three sequences in which I'm able to understand and are able to contextualize in my paper also, that how migration cannot be always considered as a poverty reduction tool, and how the approaches related to urban poverty plays a major obstacle to the poverty reduction tool also, and how it results into situational poverty altogether. But another very interesting issue is that is about existing public distribution system altogether. As I already says that it may play a very important role for the food insecurity altogether. But due to there are many barriers, there are many administrative barriers which plays a very important role, which needs to be identified altogether. As I said, population is a major problem in our country also, especially in the rural area altogether. Now, in those cases, we have found out there are there is an identification card, we call this Aadhaar identification card, based upon which the public distribution, the direct benefit transfer has mechanism has been given to the poor people also. But we found out that there are many illegal cards which has been created also. So which means there's a lack of accountability, there's a lack of transparency even in the implementation of so-called this PDS system also. Now the real question comes how to overcome this situation also, because we found out that the poor people, even there are many extreme poor people who has not been identified, that yes, these are the extreme poor people which came below the poverty line altogether. And that is why this public distribution system, because of situational poverty, has facing more problem altogether there also. So the question might come altogether whether this existing public system may play a very important role in that regard also or not. And that's how this my paper is going to play a very important role. That you see, there's a lack of conceptual and theoretical understanding of poverty altogether, which we need to contextualize altogether. How the poverty has to be defined in that direction also. Is it necessary that we need to estimate the poverty in that direction also or not? Poverty, even in the social culture and the spatial groups, is more serious in nature also. So in maybe we have to understand that the resilience of poverty is actually represents a major threat for the survival, even for and also for the well-being also. So that is how this seems to be very important in nature also. We need to understand that, you see, migration is usually considered as a contractual arrangement in every household activity also. In every household, it is expected that one person, the male person, will go to an urban city also, and he will work there also, and then after after the end of the month, the moment he gets the salary, he will transfer the amount. He will involve the process of remittance to the family members also. Now, this is the usual practice which we follow for the last 60 to 70 years also. But the real issue is also, do you think that because of the lack of access to social insurance and number of investment, whether this kind of this remittance will actually work in the long run also? Again, that is a major question altogether. So in that direction, I'm trying to consider that, you see, poverty eradication can remain a component for an overall development also. And it is only possible when you have adopt multi-dimensional social protection for also, where you might need to empower the medium scale enterprises and small scale enterprises also. And in fact, it is also very much important to adopt legal empowerment for the poor also. That this LEP is somehow very prevalent in many African countries also. So many South Asian countries can actually take inspiration from this legal empowerment altogether also. That how legal empowerment to the poor may be important for all those people who have suffered, all those migrant workers who are now suffering the problem of poverty in the developing states like India also. So in those cases, there can be many issues of legal empowerment of poverty, which seems to be analyzed, which needs to be contextualized also. For example, access to proper justice also. The labor rights, which seems to be very important in nature also. Many migrant women or many migrant children also, which has been exploited in this pandemic phase altogether also. So in that case, the labor life seems to be very important in nature altogether. That what kind of salary which they are getting, what kind of wages is which they are getting also, maybe as a permanent worker or maybe as a temporary worker also. It is very much important to understand the property rights also. So in the legal empowerment to the poor, property right is also seems to be very important there also, especially with regard to seasonal migrants also. Those seasonal migrants who may go to from rural to urban area or urban to rural area also, only for getting more economic opportunities also. So in that direction also, even the property right seems to be very important in nature also. Can be other more rights, like business rights seems to be very crucial in nature altogether. As I said earlier, that may be useful for the small scale enterprises and the medium scale enterprises also. In those direction, if we need to create a standard operating procedure, how this business size can play actually or play a very important role. So yes, the state may play a very important role, even in the case of this legal empowerment of to the poor also. And especially in that direction, we can able to achieve the poverty eradication by reducing all possible kinds of administrative barriers also. So this is how I'm able to contextualize my whole paper altogether. And I'm welcome for any suggestions, any comments, or any questions in that regard.
Many thanks again, Dr. Zubair Khan from India. And I'm going now to stop recording so we can open for questions and answers with all our participants. So give me a second.